The debate surrounding Messianic Judaism is rarely a calm exchange of arguments. It unfolds at the intersection of identity, theology, and history, which makes it so charged. For some, Messianic Judaism represents an authentic return to the first-century movement of Jewish followers of Jesus. For others, it is an evangelical missionary strategy wrapped in Jewish form, a movement that crosses the boundaries of integrity and thus poses a threat to the continuity of Jewish life. The tension between these two readings becomes visible in the clash between figures such as Michael Brown and Tovia Singer, each speaking from within his own worldview and barely touching the other. Within the Messianic movement itself, there is a clear conviction that rabbinic tradition is not the natural habitat of faith in Jesus. Michael Brown expresses this with striking clarity. The Talmud and halakhic tradition, he argues, are human constructions born of the flesh, whereas Messianic faith is rooted in the Spirit. He appeals to Jesus' words about human traditions that obscure the commandment of God. For Brown, Messianic faith is a new covenant that cannot fit into the old wineskins of rabbinic tradition. The movement should not become more Jewish, but more Christ-centered, not more halakha, but more Spirit. In that vision, avoiding the Talmud is not disguise but theological purity. Observing rabbinic law is seen as a snare that can suffocate spiritual life and distract believers from the simplicity of faith in Yeshua. Yet this theological purity is not merely a rejection of rabbinic tradition, it is deeply shaped by Protestant, especially evangelical, Christianity. The Messianic movement has adopted several core doctrines that do not originate in Judaism but in the Reformation and its heirs. The doctrine of justification by faith alone, which has no equivalent in Judaism, forms one of the pillars of Messianic theology. The idea that a person is justified not by deeds, not by halakhic fidelity, but by an inner act of faith comes directly from the Protestant tradition of Luther and Calvin. Likewise, the emphasis on Jesus' substitutionary death as atonement for sin is not a Jewish concept. In the Tanakh there is no notion that a human sacrifice removes the sins of others. Human offerings are explicitly forbidden. The Messianic movement follows here the evangelical doctrine of substitutionary atonement, in which Jesus' death is viewed as a juridical sacrifice that removes human guilt. The language of personal conversion, rebirth, and individual salvation also aligns seamlessly with evangelical Christianity, not with Judaism, which thinks in terms of peoplehood, covenant, and way of life. Even the rejection of the Talmud as human tradition mirrors the Protestant reflex to set Scripture against tradition, as Luther and Calvin did against the ecclesial tradition of their time. In this sense, Messianic Judaism is not only a movement that uses Jewish forms but one deeply shaped by Protestant theology. From the Orthodox Jewish world, a very different voice is heard. There, Messianic Judaism is not regarded as an alternative Jewish stream but as a form of deception. The criticism is not only theological but also moral. Rabbis point out that the movement selectively shops among Jewish symbols, a talith here, a shofar there, a festival celebrated without the halakhic framework that gives it meaning. The use of the title, rabbi, by Messianic leaders is felt as particularly painful, because it suggests participation in a tradition that they in fact reject. In the Jewish world, a rabbi is someone deeply rooted in the Talmud and Mishnah. One who rejects that tradition yet bears the title is seen as using the symbols of a people without bearing their responsibility. From that perspective, Messianic Judaism is not an authentic Jewish movement, but an evangelical strategy that employs Jewish forms to bring Jews to Jesus. It is not only theologically unacceptable but existentially threatening, touching centuries of attempts to convert Jews, often under pressure or coercion. The Messianic movement often justifies its distance from the Talmud with a historical argument. It sees itself not as an evangelical variant of Christianity but as a restoration of the original Jewish faith in Jesus, as it existed before the rise of rabbinic Judaism. The destruction of the Temple in 70 CE and the revolt of 135 CE are viewed as moments when Jewish life was forced to develop in a new direction. The rabbis who subsequently shaped the tradition are, in this view, not the natural heirs of biblical faith but the architects of a new religious system. Messianic Judaism thus sees itself as a return to the Nazarene movement of the first century, Jewish, yet unbound by later halakhic tradition. In that reading, Messianic Judaism is not disguise but restoration. Still, there is an undeniable overlap with the evangelical world. The missionary impulse, the focus on personal conversion, the idea that Jews are fulfilled only when they acknowledge Jesus, these are elements drawn directly from evangelical Christianity. Groups such as Jews for Jesus are actively supported by evangelical churches, and the language of fulfilled Jews implies that traditional Judaism is incomplete without Christ. For many Jews, this is not only theologically unacceptable but existentially threatening. It touches the question of who has the right to define what is Jewish, and who is the heir of a tradition transmitted for millennia. Whether Messianic Judaism is authentic or a disguised missionary movement cannot be answered simply. It depends on perspective. From the rabbinic standpoint, it is a movement that uses Jewish symbols without Jewish substance, and thus misleading and dangerous. From the Messianic standpoint, it is a return to an older, purer form of Jewish faith in which Jesus stands at the center and human traditions are set aside. The overlap with evangelical methods is, for them, not evidence of disguise but proof that they follow the new covenant freed from human additions. When all lines are drawn together, it becomes clear that Messianic Judaism is not a Jewish reform movement, but a variant of evangelical Christianity. Its faith does not rest on covenantal thought or halakhic practice but on doctrines that stem directly from the Protestant tradition: justification by faith alone, the substitutionary death of Jesus as bloody atonement for sin, and the conviction that this sacrifice is the sole path to reconciliation with God. Moreover, Jesus is not merely seen as Messiah but as the Son of God within the Trinity, a concept that lies outside the bounds of Jewish monotheism. The deliberate rejection of rabbinic tradition, of the Talmud and Halakha, confirms that this movement does not operate within Jewish thought but within the framework of evangelical Christianity. What remains is not a new form of Jewish faith but a Christian theology in Jewish language, a movement that bears the symbols of Israel yet breathes the spirit of the Reformation. I therefore choose to regard Messianic Judaism as an evangelical expression, not an authentic Jewish stream, a faith whose roots lie in the church, not in the synagogue.